The radio crackled with static at 5:47 a.m., breaking the silence that had blanketed the communications tower for hours. Lieutenant Sarah Vance pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, her heart hammering as she watched 200 enemy soldiers emerge from the morning mist like ghosts materializing from another world. They moved with deadly precision across the valley below, their weapons glinting in the pale dawn light. She had a choice that would echo through history: abandon her post and live, or stand her ground and give her unit the precious time they needed to escape. The tower behind her held the only communication link for 50 miles. If it fell, her entire battalion would be cut off, surrounded, and slaughtered. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, thinking of her daughter's laugh, her husband's warm embrace, the life she might never see again. When she opened them, her hands were steady on her rifle. She keyed the radio one last time. "This is Tower 7. I'm going to buy you some time. Make it count." What happened next would become legend, whispered in military academies and remembered in the hearts of those who believe that one person can change the course of history. This is the true story of Lieutenant Vance's impossible stand, where courage met overwhelming odds in the breaking light of dawn. The morning of September 15th began like any other for Lieutenant Sarah Vance. She climbed the narrow metal stairs of Tower 7 at exactly 5 a.m., carrying her standard equipment and a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold in the mountain air. The communications tower stood 70 feet high on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Kundari Valley, its red warning lights blinking steadily against the dark sky. Sarah had been stationed at this remote outpost for 6 months, maintaining radio contact between the main base and the forward units scattered across the treacherous terrain. It was lonely work, but she found peace in the routine. Every morning, she would check the equipment, run diagnostics on the radio systems, and settle in for another day of relaying messages between soldiers who depended on her voice to stay connected to the world. At 28 years old, Sarah had already served 2 tours of duty. She was known for her calm demeanor under pressure and her unwavering dedication to her fellow soldiers. Her commanding officers respected her technical skills, while her peers appreciated her dry sense of humor and the way she never complained, even when supplies ran low or the generator failed during thunderstorms. The tower itself was a marvel of military engineering, designed to withstand harsh weather and enemy attacks. Its thick concrete base housed the main communication equipment, backup power systems, and enough supplies to last a small crew for weeks. The upper levels contained the radio arrays, satellite dishes, and the small observation deck where Sarah spent most of her time monitoring transmissions. As dawn approached on that fateful morning, Sarah noticed something unusual in the valley below. Through her binoculars, she spotted movement in the dense forest that covered the eastern slopes. At first, she assumed it was wildlife or perhaps a patrol from one of their own units. But, as the minutes passed and the shapes became clearer, her blood ran cold. Enemy soldiers were emerging from the tree-line in organized formations. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a well-trained army, not the scattered groups of insurgents the base had been expecting. Sarah counted at least 50 in the first wave, then another 50, and another. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the focus on her binoculars, hoping she was wrong about what she was seeing. But there was no mistake. 200 enemy fighters had somehow infiltrated their territory undetected, and they were heading straight for the communications hub that Sarah was sworn to protect. She immediately reached for her radio, knowing that warning the base was her first priority. "Base Command, this is Tower 7. I have visual confirmation of approximately 200 enemy combatants approaching from the east. They appear to be well-armed and organized. Request immediate backup and extraction protocols." The response came quickly, but it wasn't what Sarah wanted to hear. "Tower 7, Base Command. All available units are currently engaged in Operation Clearwater. No backup available for at least 4 hours. You are ordered to evacuate immediately and destroy all sensitive equipment before departure." Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief. 4 hours was an eternity in combat time. The enemy would reach her position in less than 30 minutes, and, if they captured the tower intact, they would have access to all military communications in the region. Worse, they would be able to intercept and redirect messages, potentially leading entire units into ambushes. She looked down at the valley again. The enemy forces had split into 3 groups, clearly intending to surround the tower and cut off any escape routes. They had studied this position carefully, probably for weeks, and now they were executing their plan with military precision. Sarah's training kicked in as she began calculating her options. The standard protocol was clear: preserve human life above all else, evacuate when outnumbered, and deny the enemy any tactical advantage by destroying equipment before withdrawal. But, following protocol would leave her battalion blind and vulnerable, cut off from crucial intelligence and unable to coordinate their movements. She thought about the soldiers currently deployed in forward positions throughout the valley. Without communication support, they would be sitting ducks when the enemy decided to expand their offensive. Captain Morrison's unit was investigating reports of weapons caches 15 miles to the north. Sergeant Rodriguez had taken a reconnaissance team into the western hills. Neither group had any idea that a major enemy force was now operating in their area. The radio crackled again with an incoming transmission from one of the forward teams. Tower 7, this is Alpha Team. We're encountering unexpected resistance at grid reference 247 Alpha. Request support and backup units. Over. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she realized the full scope of the situation. The enemy hadn't just sent 200 soldiers to capture her tower. They had launched a coordinated offensive across the entire region, and the various units were already engaging without knowing the true size of the force they were facing. She keyed her microphone and responded with forced calm. Alpha Team, Tower 7. Backup is not currently available. Suggest you establish defensive positions and await further orders. I'll relay your situation to Base Command. But, even as she spoke, Sarah knew that Base Command was in no position to help anyone. The main force was committed to their own operation, and, by the time they realized what was happening in the valley, it would be too late for everyone. Sarah walked to the edge of the observation deck and looked out over the landscape she had come to know so well. The morning sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and orange, and, under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Instead, she was watching an enemy army advance toward a position that she was supposed to abandon. The tactical situation was impossible. If she followed orders and evacuated, the tower would fall within minutes of her departure. The enemy would have complete control over regional communications, and every unit in the field would be operating blind. But, if she stayed, she would be facing 200 trained soldiers with nothing but her service rifle, limited ammunition, and whatever improvised defenses she could create. Sarah had always been practical about her military service. She understood that soldiers sometimes died in the line of duty, and she had made peace with that possibility long ago. But, she had never imagined facing a situation where her death might actually serve a greater purpose than her survival. The radio buzzed with another transmission, this one from Sergeant Rodriguez's team. Tower 7, we've got movement on our eastern flank. Looks like a large force, but we can't get a clear count. What's your assessment of enemy activity in the region? Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Rodriguez was 12 miles away with only 6 soldiers. If she told him the truth about the 200 enemy fighters, he might panic or make tactical errors that would get his entire team killed. But, if she didn't warn him, he would continue his mission without knowing that he was vastly outnumbered. She decided on a middle course, providing enough information to keep him alert without causing panic. Rodriguez, Tower 7. We're tracking increased enemy activity throughout the sector. Recommend you proceed with extreme caution and establish regular check-in schedules. If you encounter superior forces, prioritize survival over mission completion. As she spoke, Sarah realized that she was already making the choice that would define her final hours. she wasn't going to evacuate. She was going to stay at her post and fight for as long as possible, buying time for the scattered units to recognize the threat and adapt their strategies accordingly. The enemy was now less than 20 minutes from her position. Sarah began her preparations, checking her weapons, inventorying her ammunition, and studying the terrain around the tower for defensive advantages. She had enough supplies for several days, assuming she could hold the position long enough to use them. The concrete structure of the tower would provide excellent protection from small arms fire, and the elevated position gave her a commanding view of all approach routes. The metal stairs leading to her level could be defended by a single person, at least temporarily, and she had explosives that could bring down entire sections if necessary. But Sarah wasn't fooling herself about the odds. 200 soldiers could overwhelm any defensive position given enough time and determination. Her goal wasn't to win an impossible battle, but to delay the inevitable long enough for her fellow soldiers to escape the trap that was closing around them. She sat down at her radio console and began composing a final message to base command. The words came slowly at first, but then, faster as she found her resolve. She wanted her commanders to understand her decision, and she wanted her family to know that she had chosen her duty over her own survival for reasons that mattered. The sun was fully above the horizon now, and Sarah could see individual faces among the approaching enemy soldiers. They were moving with confidence, probably expecting to find the tower abandoned or lightly defended. They had no idea that Lieutenant Sarah Vance had decided to make her last stand in the shadow of Tower 7, where the morning light was about to witness something extraordinary. The first shot rang out at exactly 6:23 a.m., echoing across the valley like thunder. Sarah had positioned herself behind the reinforced concrete barrier on the tower's middle level, her rifle trained on the lead group of enemy soldiers as they crossed the open ground below. She had waited until they were well within range, hoping to maximize the shock of her initial response. Her bullet found its mark, and the enemy formation immediately scattered for cover. Shouts erupted from multiple positions as the soldiers realized they were facing active resistance rather than an abandoned outpost. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile as she watched them dive behind rocks and trees, their carefully planned assault suddenly thrown into chaos. The return fire came quickly, bullets striking the concrete around her position with sharp cracks that sent chips of stone flying through the air. Sarah kept her head down and moved to a different firing position, knowing that staying in one spot for too long would be fatal. The tower's design worked in her favor, with multiple levels and angles that allowed her to appear and disappear like a ghost. Through her earpiece, she could hear the radio chatter from units throughout the region. Word was spreading that Tower 7 was under attack, and the forward teams were beginning to realize the scope of the enemy offensive. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the static, urgent and strained. "Tower 7, what's your status? We're hearing heavy gunfire from your direction." Sarah pressed herself against the wall as another volley of bullets struck nearby. "Morrison, Tower 7 is under siege by approximately 200 hostiles. I'm holding position to maintain communications. You need to extract your teams immediately and establish defensive positions at Rally Point Charlie." "Negative, Tower 7. We're coming to assist your position." "That's a direct order to stay away, Captain. They're waiting for you to do exactly that. Get your people to safety and coordinate with base command for a larger response." Sarah could hear the frustration in Morrison's voice, but she also heard him relay orders to his unit. They would follow her instructions, even though every instinct told them to help their isolated comrade. It was the kind of discipline that separated professional soldiers from amateurs, and Sarah was grateful that her fellow officers understood the bigger picture. The enemy had regrouped and was now advancing on multiple fronts. Sarah could see soldiers moving through the tree line on three sides of the tower, their movements coordinated by hand signals and short-range radio communications. They were professional fighters, not the irregular militia forces that had been causing trouble in other regions. She shifted to the eastern window and opened fire on a group attempting to use a fallen log for cover. Her shots were precise and measured, each one carefully aimed to maximum effect. She had learned marksmanship from her father during childhood hunting trips, and military training had refined those skills to a lethal edge. The psychological impact of her resistance was becoming apparent. The enemy had expected to overrun the position quickly, but now they were taking casualties and facing an opponent who clearly intended to fight to the death. Their advance slowed as they began treating the tower as a serious fortification rather than a simple obstacle. Sarah used the lull to check her ammunition supplies and assess the damage to the communications equipment. A stray bullet had damaged one of the radio arrays, but the main systems were still operational. She quickly transmitted updated intelligence to all units in the region, providing detailed information about enemy positions, numbers, and movement patterns. All units, this is Tower 7 with tactical update. Enemy force consists of approximately 200 soldiers organized into 3 assault teams. They have advanced small arms and appear to be using military-grade communications equipment. Primary approach vectors are from the east, south, and northeast. Western approach remains clear for the next 15 minutes. The information would be invaluable for any rescue attempts or coordinated responses. More importantly, it would help the scattered units avoid walking into ambushes as they attempted to return to base. Sarah felt a measure of satisfaction knowing that her continued resistance was serving a purpose beyond simple defiance. The enemy commander had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. Sarah watched through her binoculars as soldiers began setting up what appeared to be a mortar position in the valley below. If they brought indirect fire weapons into play, the tower's concrete protection would become much less effective. She keyed her radio again, this time addressing Base Command directly. Base Command, Tower 7. Enemy is establishing indirect fire capabilities. If you're planning any kind of rescue operation, now would be the time. Otherwise, I recommend you prepare for loss of communications in this sector. The response came from Colonel Hayes himself, the base commander who had always treated Sarah with respect and professional courtesy. His voice carried the weight of impossible decisions. Tower 7, Base Command. Rescue operations are not feasible at this time. You are authorized to destroy sensitive equipment and evacuate immediately. Understood, Base Command. But, I'm going to stay with the equipment as long as possible. These boys out here need someone watching their backs. There was a long pause before Hayes responded. Sarah, you don't have to do this. It was the first time he had used her first name over official communications, and Sarah understood what he was really saying. He was giving her permission to run, to save herself while there was still time. But, she had already made her choice, and nothing was going to change her mind. Colonel, somebody needs to hold this position. Might as well be me. The mortar rounds began falling 20 minutes later, their explosions shaking the entire tower structure. Sarah had moved to the lowest level where the concrete was thickest, but she could still feel each impact through the floor and walls. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several pieces of equipment were damaged by the concussions. Between bombardments, she continued returning rifle fire whenever enemy soldiers attempted to advance. Her ammunition was running low, but she made every shot count, forcing the attackers to remain cautious and slow their approach. Each minute she delayed them was another minute for friendly units to establish better defensive positions. The radio brought news from across the region as the enemy offensive expanded. Rodriguez's team had encountered a blocking force and was pinned down 6 miles from safety. Morrison's unit was fighting a running battle against superior numbers while attempting to reach Rally Point Charlie. 2 other teams had gone silent entirely, their fate unknown. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These soldiers were counting on her to maintain communications, to serve as their link to command authority and tactical coordination. As long as Tower 7 remained operational, they had hope of rescue or reinforcement. If she fell, they would be truly alone in hostile territory. The enemy tactics shifted again as afternoon approached. Instead of direct assaults, they began positioning snipers in the surrounding hills, taking shots at the tower whenever Sarah appeared at a window or firing position. The psychological pressure was enormous, knowing that a single mistake could end her resistance in an instant. She adapted by moving constantly, never appearing at the same position twice, and using mirrors and other reflective surfaces to observe enemy movements without exposing herself. The tower's design included several hidden passages and maintenance areas that provided alternative routes between levels, and Sarah used these to appear in unexpected locations. The strain was beginning to show in her communications. Her voice remained steady and professional, but those who knew her could hear the exhaustion creeping in. She had been fighting for over 6 hours, maintaining communications while engaging a force that outnumbered her 40-1. The physical and mental demands were pushing her to the limits of human endurance. Captain Morrison's voice came through the radio with news that offered a glimmer of hope. Tower 7, Alpha Team has reached Rally Point Charlie and established defensive positions. We're coordinating with Base Command for a relief column. Outstanding, Captain. What's your timeline? Base Command estimates 3 hours before they can launch an operation. Can you hold that long? Sarah looked around at her dwindling ammunition supplies, the damaged equipment, and the concrete walls that were beginning to show cracks from repeated mortar impacts. 3 hours felt like an eternity under current conditions, but she forced optimism into her voice. I'll be here when you arrive, Morrison. Just make sure you bring some extra ammunition. I'm running a little low. The enemy had apparently intercepted the transmission, because the mortar bombardment resumed with renewed intensity. They knew that time was now working against them, and they were determined to overwhelm the tower before any rescue could arrive. Sarah pressed herself against the strongest wall she could find and endured the barrage, counting the seconds between impacts and trying to predict when they would attempt their next assault. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sarah realized that she had accomplished something remarkable. She had held a communications post against impossible odds for over 8 hours, maintaining tactical coordination for units across an entire region while facing overwhelming enemy forces. Soldiers were alive because of her sacrifice, and that knowledge gave her strength to continue fighting. But the hardest part was still ahead. The enemy knew about the approaching relief column, and they would make one final, desperate attempt to take the tower before reinforcements could arrive. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition one more time and prepared for the battle that would determine whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile. The final assault began at sunset, with the enemy launching coordinated attacks from all directions simultaneously. Sarah could hear their commanders shouting orders in the valley below, their voices carrying a note of desperation as they realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The approaching relief column had been detected by their scouts, and they knew this was their last chance to capture the communications hub. Sarah had positioned herself in the tower's central core, surrounded by backup radio equipment and her remaining ammunition. She had perhaps 30 rounds left, along with 2 grenades and a combat knife. It wasn't much against 200 soldiers, but she had learned to make every resource count during her long day of resistance. The mortar bombardment had stopped, probably because the enemy didn't want to risk damaging the equipment they were trying to capture. This gave Sarah a brief respite from the constant concussions, though the silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. She used the quiet moments to transmit what might be her final status report. Base Command, Tower 7. Enemy is beginning final assault from multiple vectors. I have limited ammunition remaining, but communications equipment is still operational. Estimated time to position being overrun is 30 to 40 minutes. Colonel Hayes responded immediately, his voice tight with concern. Tower 7, relief column is 15 minutes from your position. Can you hold that long? Sarah looked through the reinforced windows at the enemy soldiers advancing up the rocky slope. They were moving with renewed confidence, knowing that their overwhelming numbers would eventually prevail. She could see individual faces now, young men who were following orders just as she was, caught in a conflict that none of them had chosen. "I'll do my best, Colonel. But, if I don't make it, tell my family that I was thinking about them at the end." She didn't wait for a response before switching to tactical frequencies and, beginning what would become known as the most remarkable combat coordination in military history. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah directed artillery strikes, guided helicopter gunships, and coordinated ground movements while simultaneously fighting off multiple assault teams attempting to breach the tower. The enemy had brought ladders and climbing equipment, attempting to scale the tower's exterior walls while other teams tried to force entry through the reinforced door at the base. Sarah moved between firing positions like a deadly phantom, appearing at windows to deliver precise shots before disappearing into the tower's maze of passages and maintenance areas. Her marksmanship had reached an almost supernatural level, each shot carefully calculated for maximum psychological impact as well as tactical effectiveness. Enemy soldiers began hesitating before advancing, knowing that the sniper in the tower never missed and seemed to appear wherever they least expected resistance. The radio crackled with reports from the approaching relief column. "Tower 7, Rescue 1. We have visual on your position and are engaging enemy forces on the eastern perimeter. Hold your position, we're almost there." Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope as she watched helicopters approaching from the north, their weapon systems already targeting enemy positions in the valley below. Apache gunships swept across the landscape like mechanical angels of death, their chain guns tearing through enemy formations with devastating efficiency. But, the soldiers closest to the tower were not deterred by the air support. They had committed everything to this final assault, and they pressed their attack even as their comrades were being decimated in the surrounding hills. Sarah could hear boots on the metal stairs below her position, the sound of the tower's defenses finally being breached. She grabbed her remaining grenades and moved to the stairwell, knowing that this would be her final stand. The enemy soldiers were climbing cautiously, aware that their target was still armed and dangerous. Sarah could hear them communicating in whispered voices, trying to coordinate their approach without alerting her to their exact positions. The first grenade detonated on the lower stairwell, its explosion echoing through the tower's interior like thunder in a metal tube. Sarah heard screams and the sound of bodies falling, but she knew that more soldiers would be coming. She had bought herself perhaps 5 more minutes, no more. The radio buzzed with excited voices as the relief column engaged enemy forces throughout the valley. "Tower 7, this is Captain Morrison. We've broken through the eastern perimeter and are advancing on your position. What's your status?" "Morrison, Tower 7. I've got hostiles inside the tower structure. They're on the lower levels and climbing fast. You need to hurry if you want to find me breathing." Sarah's voice remained calm despite the desperate nature of her situation. She had accepted her likely fate hours ago, and now she was simply focused on holding her position for as long as physically possible. Each additional minute gave the relief force more time to secure the surrounding area and prevent the enemy from establishing fallback positions. The sound of boots on metal resumed, closer this time. Sarah positioned herself at the top of the stairwell with her service rifle, its barrel trained on the narrow opening where the enemy would have to appear. She had perhaps 15 rounds remaining, and she intended to make each one count. The first enemy soldier appeared around the corner cautiously, his weapon sweeping the area for targets. Sarah's shot took him center mass, and his body tumbled back down the stairs, creating an obstacle for those behind him. She immediately shifted position, knowing that they would return fire at her last known location. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls where she had been standing moments before, their metallic whine filling the air with deadly music. Sarah waited for the firing to stop before appearing at a different angle, her rifle finding another target in the stairwell below. The enemy soldiers were brave and well-trained, but they were trapped in a confined space against an opponent who knew every inch of the terrain. The battle for the stairwell continued for what felt like hours but was actually only minutes. Sarah used her remaining ammunition with surgical precision, each shot carefully aimed to create maximum disruption among the climbing soldiers. She could hear more troops entering the tower's base level, but the narrow stairs created a bottleneck that worked in her favor. Her last bullet took down an enemy officer who was attempting to coordinate the assault from the middle landing. Sarah watched him fall before throwing her empty rifle aside and drawing her combat knife. If they wanted the tower, they would have to take it from her hands personally. The helicopter gunships outside had eliminated most of the enemy forces in the valley, but the soldiers inside the tower were beyond the reach of air support. Sarah could hear Captain Morrison's voice on the radio, reporting that ground forces were breaching the tower's perimeter, but she knew they would arrive too late to affect the outcome of her personal battle. 3 enemy soldiers appeared at the top of the stairwell simultaneously, their weapons trained on Sarah's position behind an overturned equipment rack. She had nowhere left to run, no more ammunition, and no reasonable hope of survival. But Lieutenant Sarah Vance had never been particularly interested in reasonable outcomes. She launched herself at the nearest soldier, her combat knife finding its target before he could bring his rifle to bear. The other 2 soldiers hesitated for a crucial second, unwilling to fire while their comrade was grappling with their target. That hesitation cost them dearly as Sarah rolled away from the falling body and threw her knife at the second attacker with deadly accuracy. The 3rd soldier managed to get off several shots, but Sarah was already moving, using the tower's equipment and furniture as cover while she closed the distance between them. She reached him just as his rifle jammed, and the fight devolved into hand-to-hand combat between 2 exhausted warriors who had given everything to their respective causes. Sarah's military training served her well in the brutal close-quarters struggle, but she was weakened by hours of combat and blood loss from multiple minor wounds. The enemy soldier was younger and stronger, and gradually gained the upper hand despite her superior technique and desperate determination. As they grappled near the tower's main communications console, Sarah realized that she had one final option available to her. The explosive charges she had prepared for destroying the sensitive equipment were still armed and ready. If she couldn't hold the tower, she could at least deny it to the enemy and ensure that her sacrifice had meaning. The sound of American voices echoing up the stairwell told her that Morrison's rescue team had finally arrived, but they were still fighting their way through the remaining enemy soldiers on the lower levels. Sarah knew they would reach her position eventually, but the question was whether she would still be alive to greet them. Her hand found the detonator switch for the explosive charges, and for a moment she hesitated. Using the explosives would destroy the communications equipment she had fought so hard to protect, but it would also eliminate any chance that the enemy could benefit from capturing the tower. It was a choice between tactical victory and strategic success. The enemy soldier managed to pin her against the communications console, his hands around her throat as he attempted to strangle the life from her body. Sarah's vision began to blur as her oxygen supply was cut off, but she forced her fingers to find the detonator switch. If this was how her story ended, she would write the final chapter herself. Captain Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away as unconsciousness approached. Tower 7, we've secured the lower levels. What's your status? Sarah tried to respond, but she had no breath left for words. Instead, she did what Lieutenant Sarah Vance had always done in impossible situations. She found a way to complete her mission despite overwhelming odds. Her thumb pressed the detonator switch just as the rescue team burst through the final doorway, their weapons trained on the enemy soldier who had been seconds away from claiming his victory. The explosions that followed were relatively small, designed to destroy sensitive equipment rather than bring down the entire tower structure. But they accomplished their purpose, ensuring that months of intelligence gathering and tactical planning would provide no benefit to enemy forces. The communications hub that Sarah had died defending would never serve those who had tried to take it from her. In the weeks that followed, military investigators would piece together the full scope of Lieutenant Vance's remarkable last stand. She had held a strategic position against 200 enemy soldiers for over 10 hours, maintaining communications for scattered units while coordinating their eventual rescue. Her sacrifice had saved dozens of lives and prevented a major tactical defeat from becoming a strategic disaster. The tower was rebuilt within a month, its new communications array more powerful and sophisticated than its predecessor. A bronze plaque was installed at the base of the structure, bearing a simple inscription that would be read by thousands of soldiers in the years to come. Lieutenant Sarah Vance held this position against impossible odds so that others might live. Her courage echoes in these hills forever. But, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Sarah's memory was not the plaque or the medals posthumously awarded by grateful commanders. It was the knowledge that her example had inspired a generation of soldiers to understand that sometimes, one person really can make a difference. In military academies around the world, young officers would study the Battle of Tower 7 and learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Sarah Vance had answered that call in the breaking light of dawn, and her story would never be forgotten by those who believe that honor is worth any sacrifice.